So for today's message, I actually want to give my 6-year-old daughter Addison credit for this idea. A few weeks ago, we found ourselves with a Sunday afternoon off, and we're just trying to kill some time. We're looking for something to do. And we decided to go out to Kensington, to the Metro Park. Here's a plug, a lot of great things to do for kids 12 and under. But we were on our way there, just get some fresh air, enjoy the day, enjoy the quiet time. And on the way there, Addison, she didn't seem very excited. And as we're driving, she proceeds to ask this question. She says, "Why do we always have to do stuff?" In the precious voice of a 6-year-old girl. She says, "I wake up, I go to school, I come home, I clean my room, mom makes me vacuum, then we go to ballet or church, and when I get home, I have to take a bath and get ready for bed." You could hear the fatigue. You could hear the fatigue in her voice. She was desperate. She was desperate for some rest. And even in the innocence of a child, you could hear that she was weary. She was tired, and she needed some rest. Even to the point of something that she loved to do. Go to Kensington, play at the playground. It didn't seem fun anymore. She was burned out. So here's a question. How many of you can relate to that? And I know you can. I know you can. See, a few weeks ago, I was leading a small group, and before the study started, I wanted to check in with everybody. I just wanted to check in, see how everybody's doing. So I asked a simple question. How's it going? How's everybody doing? Crickets. All I could hear was crickets. The sound of silence. So I decided to draw it out a little bit. Does anybody have a victory to share? Something positive from the week? Something you could celebrate? And the room remained quiet. As I looked around the room, I could see the room was tired, so I asked one more follow-up question. I knew I'd get a response. I said, "Who's exhausted?" Every hand in the room went up. I know it's a small sample size, but I believe many of us are feeling more run down than refreshed. And it's affecting our minds. It's affecting our attitudes. It's affecting our spiritual health in a pretty profound way. See, I don't think the human spirit is conditioned for the world that we live in. It's too fast. There's too much information. We're always on the go, and we're always pulled in a different direction. I don't think that's good for the human spirit. About 30 years ago, when computers became mainstream, the idea was that this new technology would simplify our lives, that would make it easier. It would be a tool that would help assist us in our day-to-day job, in our day-to-day life. In a lot of ways, that was accomplished, but we have to recognize it came with a cost. Instead of decreasing the workload, it became an avenue for an increased workload. Between constant access and accessibility, compounded with the speed of communication, and that deadline-driven world that we live in, this workload has increased dramatically. See, as we carry our computers in our pocket on a daily basis, this has become the norm, week after week after week. We used to be a 40-hour work week is now a 60-hour work week where we jam 80 hours of work into it. We have created a pathway for extra burdens, extra worries, extra stress, and this comes with an enormous amount of pressure. And we wonder why our nation is plagued with anxiety, depression, and mental health issues. Think about it. We can't begin to process all this information that we're presented with. It's too much. It's overload, and it affects every single decision that we make, every one of them. We're not designed to process all this information. I can't even watch Netflix anymore. It's hard because it's hard to find something to watch because there's just too many options. In the first 5 minutes of scrolling, I get overwhelmed because of all the possibilities. I try to weigh out what's good, what's my mood, try to overanalyze what is the best choice for this moment. And 5 minutes later, I end up watching nothing because of the decision fatigue. There's too many options. In the last 20 years, work is up 15%. Leisure is down 30%. That is a 45% swing in the last 20 years. How do you think the world's trending in the last 20 years? I don't know about you guys, but I long for a simpler life. I long for a simpler time. See, it's something that we used to see, and many of us used to live it. There used to be a time when the nation would shut down on Sundays. Anybody remember that? Churches had the platform. God was on the front stage. Commerce was closed. There was no community sports pulling us into 6, 7 different directions. We weren't divided. We became united. Families would gather around the table, share stories together, and discuss and celebrate what God is doing in their life. One day a week, it's 14.3% of the week was dedicated to rest. 14.3%. And I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but it adds up to 52 days in a year. Okay? Which over the average lifetime makes about 12 years of somebody's life. That's a significant chunk of time. Imagine your K through 12 experience. That's 12 years. Now imagine removing that from your life. You would probably be a radically different person. See, we live in a world where the message is get more, do more, be more. But I don't think that's God's prescription for life. See, the world prescribes pills, to-do lists, and coaching on being strong-minded. But God has a different script. It's not more. It's less. John 3:30 says, he must become greater. I must become less. See, John the Baptist understood it was good for him to be less visible and less known, so that Jesus to become more visible and more known in his life and in his ministry. There are many ways we can do that, but the Bible often points to one in particular that I'm going to talk to you about today, and it's developing a rhythm of rest that demonstrates our dependency on God to meet our needs. It's something that requires an act of faith, where we choose to not engage in the action of making more money, trying to get ahead in life, or striving to impress on other people, striving to impress on others. I'm talking about the Sabbath, which in Hebrew translates to Shabbat, meaning to cease from working, to rest. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11 says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. And the focus here is on rest and creation, understanding that God is our creator. Personally, I don't think we give enough attention to the Sabbath conversation. Based on the way God describes it, it's a really, really big deal. The passage I just read, it was taken out of the 10 Commandments that God had given Moses. And this is where God relayed to his people the true function and beauty of his laws as he was leading Israel into the life of practical holiness. The 10 Commandments are the foundation for God's kingdom. And in that, we hear about lying, stealing, even murder. But before we get to those, God talks about the Sabbath. think it's a pretty big deal. See, the first 3 commandments, it talks about man's relationship with God. You should have no other God. You should have no idol. You should not use the Lord's name in vain. Commandments 5 through 10 are about man's relationship with each other. It's about humanity. The 4th commandment, the Sabbath commandment, is where God talks about the Sabbath, and it sits right in the middle of these 2 sides. In the English language, we call this a fulcrum. Okay, it's a hinge piece that serves as a connector piece between 2 sides. It's like a bridge. So it's bringing the 2 sides together. And when we look through the passage with the same lens, we can draw the conclusion that the Sabbath is a bridge between the 2 sides of the commandments. The Sabbath, by design, is meant to connect humanity with God. Another way to say this is it's designed to bring bring us into rest with God. So what does it mean to rest? I want to take a closer look at some scriptures to help us get a better understanding of what that rest really looks like. When we look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15, I believe we can learn a lot about what the Sabbath is supposed to look like. Verse 12 says, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, your son, daughter, male, female servant, ox, donkey, animals, any foreigner residing with you, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do." Now remember this part. "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Now, if you paid any attention, it sounds very similar to what we read in Exodus, that God gave the people of Israel right before they left Egypt. In Exodus, the emphasis is on creation. Remembering the Sabbath pays tribute to the Creator and allows us to follow his example by resting on the 7th day. So it focuses on rest. But what we read here in Deuteronomy came a generation later, after Israel had spent time wandering in the wilderness, and right before Joshua had taken them to the promised land. They essentially get the same list, except in regards to the 4th commandment in reference to the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy, Israel is now told to observe the Sabbath. Verse 12 says, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you." Verse 15, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath." See, the focus has changed. It's not about rest. The focus is now on redemption. See, to observe, it's much more of an active word, suggesting that the commandment involves much more than ceasing from labor and daily activity. Specifically, God has commanded his people not only to recognize the Sabbath as a time of rest, but now as a time of worship. As they reflect on where they were and what God had done to bring them to where they're at. In fact, 9 different times in the book of Exodus, God says, "Let my people go so they can worship me by observing the Sabbath." The Israelites went from bondage to the Red Sea, to the wilderness, to a worshiping community. The whole point of their deliverance was to bring them to a place where they could worship. They were created to worship. We are created to worship. This is deliverance. This is why we worship. And it's not just their story. This is our story. See, we came from bondage. We didn't go through the Red Sea, but we went through a Red Sea of blood. Jesus' blood. And now we have this newfound freedom in Christ, and this is the reason we worship. This is the reason we slow down, we seek his presence, and celebrate the freedom that we have. We're no longer slaves. So when we talk about the Sabbath rest, we have to recognize the purpose is to engage in worship. And that worship is 100% rooted in redemption. So what does that look like? You know, what does authentic worship look like? You know, I know it sounds good in theory or theologically, but I want to talk a little bit about what it means for us when we walk out of here. How does this apply to our lives? What does a Sabbath look like in our lives today? And what are the benefits of it? What happens when we incorporate rest and worship in our regular everyday life as a rhythm? See, one of the first things that we have to recognize is rhythms are a blessing from God. We breathe in a rhythm. Our heart beats in a rhythm. My wife snores with the rhythm. God created time to follow cyclical patterns. He created time to be a predictable pattern. These are rhythms are designed from God, and they are a gift from God. Day and night, weeks and years, the 4 seasons of every year, these are the rhythms that God has created for us, and they're a gift. The first we hear of the Sabbath is in the Genesis creation story. I know many of you guys are very familiar with it. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God takes us through the creation story, showing us the foundation for his built-in rhythms. So in the first 6 days, we see God creating. We see him creating the light, the sky, the water, the land, the seas, the sun, the moon, the stars, fish and birds, animals, man and woman. And then he rested. Genesis 1, verse 31 says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. It was beautiful. It was untainted. For 6 days, God created. He established the rhythm of day and night, and in the process, he completed all that needed to be completed. The heavens and the earth were complete in 6 days. The work was done and complete, but there was still something missing. See, the creating was complete, but the week wasn't. The week wasn't perfect. Something was missing. It wasn't holy. The rhythm was missing something that needed to make it complete and to make it whole. Genesis 2, verse 3 says, by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested, Shabbat, Sabbath, from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So during the labor days, we hear God say, things are good. When he creates man and woman, it's very good, okay? But when we incorporate rest in worship, it becomes holy. See, we're not meant to live a good life or a very good life. We're meant to live a holy life. When we translate holiness, we get the idea of being whole or being complete. How many of you guys are feeling incomplete these days? See, for many of us, we're nailing it. We are nailing days 1 through 6, but we're feeling incomplete because we're not getting what we need in that 7th day. If you take a closer look, the first 6 days, you might notice a theme. When the heavens and earth were created, you will notice all these actions, all these creations are action-oriented. This is the physical work and the mental exhaustion of influencing the world around us. It was an external focus. The 7th day allowed for the 7th day it allowed for that inner work to take place. Not an external work, but a deep inner spiritual work of the soul. Time of refreshing. It was a time of refreshing. It was a restart. It was a time to celebrate with gratitude and get a renewed spiritual energy for the spiritual things that were to come next week. He called it rest. And these things are critical to the soul, because without them, we are going to feel incomplete. We are going to feel off. We are going to feel out of balance. We can be like a car driving around on a flat tire. We're going to be slower, harder to control. We're going to take more energy to travel from place to place and probably be a little more accident prone. A few weeks ago, there was a tornado in Gaylord. A video appeared on Facebook showing this natural disaster really up close, really personal. It was kind of in your face. And honestly, it was quite scary. Many of you guys probably saw it. But what caught my eye in the video was a number of cars that were driving down the road, and they just never slowed down. There's this natural disaster happening, and they're just going about their business. I remember watching the video thinking, when are we going to slow down? Like, what is it going to take for us to slow down? And there's probably a deeper question here, and that's, why won't we slow down? See, our world is moving at such a insane rate of speed, and I think we want to enjoy life at that same pace of speed. And it's a fast-paced environment, and it comes with a cost. The cost is we'll pay whatever it takes to be more happy, to have it more often, and to experience it longer. Which means more work, more resources, more time, more energy. The problem is it's not sustainable. And it forces us to become self-reliant to meet our own needs, which in return hinders our trust and our dependency on God. Just like the Israelites in the manna. They had a hard time trusting that God would provide for them the next time. They got it this time, but they were really questioning, are you going to provide for me next time? So they acted in their own power to prepare for that next time, just in case God didn't show up. And if you remember, it didn't end very well. We may not have rotten manna on our dinner plate, but the result can be a lot worse. As our spirits are being fed a different type of spiritual food, it's called discouragement, depression, and anxiety. See, when we take time to rest, we're sending God a message. We're saying, I can do it better, I know better, and that comes with a heavy, heavy, heavy burden. One of the major benefits of the Sabbath is rest that develops a personal, authentic intimacy with God. It leads to a deeper level of trust. Taking the Sabbath rest, it's an act of faith. And remember, we're called to be faithful, not successful. It's a reminder that no matter what I do, that God is in control. When we slow down and pause from pursuing our material goals each week, we're saying, God, I'm surrendering my control. I'm surrendering my pride, and I'm acknowledging you as the Lord of my life. The message now becomes, I trust you to provide for me 7 days a week, even though I'm only going to work 6. No matter how much money I could earn, no matter how much is on my to-do list, I'm going to rest my mind, I'm going to rest my body, and I am going to seek your presence. See, the more work we have, the less we focus on God. The more distracted we are, the less we acknowledge God. We are created to be in his presence and to be at rest. And when we do, we begin to understand our true purpose, why we were created, and then we receive the strength to be able to do it. In ancient times, people would travel in caravans. often with the donkey and an ox carrying the brunt of the cargo weight. It was an exhaustive work, even for an animal that was designed by God for such a task. And studies show that for 7 days, they would cover about 20 miles a day, equaling about 140 miles a week. However, when you look at the Israelites' travel patterns, the study shows things a little bit differently. Because of the Sabbath, they rested for 1 day, allowing them to only travel for 6. But here's the thing. Because of the rest day, they would only travel 6 days a week, but in those 6 days, they would travel 30 miles a week. That's 180 miles a week compared to 140 for the ones that went 7 days a week. By the end of the week, they would cover more ground, roughly 40 miles, than those that kept grinding and kept pushing through. That's about a 25% increase in efficiency. They would travel 25% further. They would get 25% more done. They worked less and became more efficient. And I believe there's a lot of wisdom in that. Proverbs 8:11 says, "For wisdom is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her." Proverbs 16:16 says, "How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver." The passage doesn't say that gold, silver, and rubies are bad. That's not what it's saying, but it's saying that wisdom is more valuable. Because when you implement the principles of wisdom, in this case, adequate rest, you will get a far greater return on your investment. You will get more by doing less because you're creating space in your life for God to work in ways that you never could. See, Jesus did far more in 3 years than most humans will do in a lifetime. And he did that while completely honoring the Sabbath process. Never breaking the principle of the Sabbath, but only breaking the tradition of the Pharisees. Jesus fully understood the Sabbath, and he never meant it to be a burden. See, the Sabbath is always meant to be a blessing. It's not meant to weigh us down, which is exactly how we need to look at it in our lives today. See, as followers today, under the new covenant of Christ, I don't believe we're required to follow the law exactly as it's presented in the Old Testament under the Old Covenant. These laws were given for a specific time, to a specific purpose, for a specific people group. It was a different covenant that got a little twisted as the Pharisees kept adding to the original law. It became a burden. This is not God's plan. This is not God's intention. As we look in our lives today, we have to recognize we are under a new covenant. Meaning many of the Old Testament laws that were more binding in the Old Testament have now become a principle or a preference for those that have a newfound, deeper freedom in Jesus Christ. So when the Old Testament laws are re-emphasized by Jesus or taught by the disciples, we look at those as more commandments and more of a binding law. These are things like loving your neighbor, love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. It's still binding because we see it re-emphasized within the New Testament. Other times we see these laws modified as that principle or preference as we find ourselves with a greater sense of freedom in Jesus Christ. These things can be the civil law, the ceremonial law, or the clean or unclean dietary laws of eating. In regards to the Sabbath, we don't view it as a commandment we're bound to. We view it as a promise, a blessing that we are invited into. Colossians 2:16-17 says, "Therefore do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are the shadows of things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ." The Apostle Paul is referring to the Jewish laws, the holiday feasts, and the Sabbath as a shadow of things to come. A shadow is a reflection of something bigger, something greater. And Paul is saying that if we follow the shadow, it should lead us to the primary object. In this case, Jesus Christ. See, a shadow is often a reflection, and oftentimes it's an avenue for communion with Jesus Christ, and it's meant to guide us into a much-needed place of worship and reflection. So how we do it, what that looks like for us in our lives today, it's gonna be a little bit different for everybody. When you take it, how you take it, where you take it, what it looks like. Okay, just like your daily Bible reading. Personally, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. I'm all about taking one day a week and trying to create that space and rhythm in my life. But there's a lot of other ways you can do that. Maybe it's taking a daily time to pray and to seek God's presence in the full armor of God before you get out the door. Maybe you schedule a quarterly retreat to get away and focus on reflection, renewal. Maybe you Sabbath with your spouse once a quarter. As you pursue Christ together, you ultimately draw closer together. Maybe it's an annual retreat to evaluate where you're heading. Maybe you have to pray through the next season of your life. See how God has been growing you, and you need to pray through your purpose for that next season. That's hard to do in 30 minutes in the morning. You know, sometimes you need more time for things like this. See, the Sabbath may or may not be a one-week experience, but I promise you, if you can find a space to disconnect from the world and to connect with your Father, you will have a renewed spiritual strength with a focused, eternal perspective. You're going to see the world differently. You're going to see yourself differently. You're going to see your family differently. You're going to see God differently. So whatever rhythm God is calling you to for your life, remember these simple rules. Number one, if you work with your mind, Sabbath with your body. If you work with your body, Sabbath with your mind. During the Sabbath time, number two, during the Sabbath time, don't impress on others. Let God impress on you. Number three, the attitude and emotions you experience, they can and most likely be a reflection of your relationship with God. If you want to take control, if you're antsy, if you want to get things done, it could be a reflection of your trust level with God. If you find peace, love, joy, and contentment, it can be a real representation of your relationship with God. And number four, our disciplines, tradition, and ceremonies, they can bring us closer to God, but they should never be a replacement for true rest that comes with Christ and Christ alone.